Welcome to West Film, where every movie has a story worth telling. From heart-pounding action to twisty mysteries and dramas that stick with you, we dig into the plot, the characters, and the moments that make each film worth your time. So grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's jump into today's movie. This is West Film. May your story starts here. End of Days, a turning point and a time capsule. End of Days marked a genuine turning point in Arnold Schwarzenegger's career. By the late 1990s, moviegoers were starting to drift away from the classic action hero archetype that had ruled the previous decade, and a new generation of stars with different sensibilities was rising up to replace it. By stepping into a darker, more emotionally demanding role, Schwarzenegger showed he was willing to reinvent himself. Critics were split on the film as a whole, but many singled out his more vulnerable, dramatic performance, acknowledging that he was reaching for something well beyond the invincible hero formula he'd built his name on. Playing opposite him as the devil himself, under the name Gabriel Byrne, cast as Satan, was an actor whose calm, understated screen presence provided a striking counterpoint to Schwarzenegger's raw emotional intensity. Byrne already carried a strong copyright, having appeared in Miller's Crossing, Little Women, The Usual Suspects, Dead Man, and a string of other well-regarded dramas. Where many actors ham up the role of Satan, Byrne went the opposite direction. His devil is charming, sharp-witted, patient, and unsettlingly courteous, someone who gets what he wants not through monstrous displays of power, but through seduction, persuasion, and quiet psychological pressure. That restraint is what makes the performance so effective. He'll smile warmly while describing something horrific, making evil feel almost mundane, a choice that suggests the real danger in the story isn't violence, but corruption and temptation working from the inside. Byrne later said he approached the part like a polished, self-assured businessman, someone whose confidence comes from thousands of years spent quietly manipulating humanity. That framing set his Satan apart from most of the devils who'd come before him on screen. Robin Tunney plays Christine York, the young woman fated to sit at the center of the devil's scheme. Before End of Days, Tunney had already made a name for herself in films like Empire Records, The Craft, and Niagara, along with several independent projects, establishing herself as an actress who could play smart, emotionally exposed characters without losing their inner steel. The role called for her to walk a line between innocence and resolve. Over the course of the story, Christine transforms from a woman baffled by the strange events unfolding around her into one who's ready to stand up to something truly monstrous. Schwarzenegger may carry most of the action, but Tunney supplies the film's emotional core. Her grounded, believable reactions keep the supernatural plot tethered to real human stakes rather than letting it drift into pure spectacle. After End of Days, Tunney's career kept building, and she eventually became widely known for her lead role on the long-running TV series The Mentalist. Kevin Pollak plays Bobby Chicago, Jericho's closest friend and former police partner. By this point Pollak was already a familiar face both as an actor and a stand-up comedian, known for A Few Good Men, Casino, Grumpy Old Men, and years of comedy work. Despite his comic reputation, he'd repeatedly proven himself in dramatic supporting parts as well. His performance here brings warmth and loyalty to the film without tipping into comic relief. Bobby is the last real link Jericho has to the life he used to have, which makes their friendship an important emotional anchor for the story. Rod Stager plays Father Kovac, one of the few people who grasps the supernatural threat closing in around everyone. Stager was already regarded as one of Hollywood's greatest actors, an Academy Award winner for In the Heat of the Night, with unforgettable turns in On the Waterfront, Dr. Zhivago, and The Pawnbroker behind him. His presence lent the film real gravitas, even in limited screen time, Stager brings an authority that makes Father Kovac feel like a man carrying centuries of hidden knowledge. Another standout supporting performance comes from CCH Pounder as Detective Marge Francis. Pounder had built a strong career across television and film, consistently earning praise for playing intelligent, no-nonsense authority figures. Arriving at the edge of a new millennium when End of Days opened in November 1999, it landed at a genuinely unusual moment in modern history. The whole world was bracing for a new millennium, and uncertainty hung over the coming arrival of the year 2000. Some people greeted the approaching century with excitement, others worried about technological breakdowns, economic collapse, religious prophecy, or even the end of civilization as they knew it. The so-called Y2K problem had become a constant topic of conversation, with governments and companies pouring enormous resources into making sure their computer systems wouldn't fail when the date rolled over. At the same time, books, documentaries, TV specials, and religious debates were fixated on end times prophecy. End of Days hit theaters right in the middle of all that, which gave its supernatural premise an odd sense of real-world relevance. Unlike disaster movies built around natural catastrophes or alien invasions, End of Days dug into humanity's oldest fear, the end times as described by religion. Its central conflict has the devil trying to fulfill an ancient prophecy that would let evil take over the earth, a premise that resonated because talk of the Book of Revelation, Armageddon, and the coming millennium was everywhere in the media at the time. News programs interviewed religious scholars, churches held discussions about biblical predictions, and even people with no particular interest in religion found themselves familiar with terms like the Antichrist and Judgment Day. The film channeled all of that anxiety into a big-budget Hollywood action thriller. Even though the story itself was invented, it leaned on religious imagery audiences already recognized: crosses, cathedrals, Latin prayers, exorcisms, prophetic visions, references to the apocalypse, all of it tapping into centuries of Christian tradition. That blend of biblical mythology and modern action filmmaking is part of what set End of Days apart from the other supernatural films of the era. The late 90s also saw a resurgence of occult thrillers and religious horror, with movies and TV shows increasingly exploring angels, demons, secret societies, and ancient prophecies. Films like The Ninth Gate, Stigmata, Fallen, and The Prophecy all showed that audiences had an appetite for stories mixing theology with suspense. End of Days became one of the most visible examples of that trend simply because it paired supernatural horror with one of the biggest action stars on the planet. Schwarzenegger's involvement carried its own cultural weight. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, he'd become the embodiment of physical strength and unshakable confidence, so casting him as a man broken by grief upended what audiences expected from him. Rather than delivering another indestructible action icon, the film presented a hero crushed by trauma, alcoholism, and despair, a part of a broader shift happening in action cinema at the time, as protagonists increasingly showed emotional vulnerability instead of sheer invincibility. Many viewers appreciated seeing Schwarzenegger explore that darker psychological territory, and while some critics questioned whether audiences actually wanted this version of the star, others praised him for taking the creative risk. Looking back, Jericho Cane has come to be seen as one of Schwarzenegger's most layered performances, one that reshaped later conversations about his range as an actor. Byrne's take on Satan added just as much to the film's lasting reputation. Earlier cinematic devils tended to lean on monstrous looks or theatrical villainy. Byrne went the other way, playing Satan as charismatic, sharp, funny, and disturbingly human, someone who could walk through a crowded street unnoticed, manipulate powerful people through simple conversation, and tempt ordinary folks by targeting their emotional weak spots rather than relying on supernatural terror. That approach mirrored a broader shift in how audiences related to on-screen villains. Increasingly, viewers found psychologically complex antagonists more compelling than purely physical threats. Byrne's performance made the case that evil could be sophisticated and persuasive rather than grotesque, and plenty of later films with manipulative supernatural villains followed that same blueprint, favoring psychological influence over visual horror. There's also an unintentional time capsule quality to the film's portrait of New York City before September 11, 2001. Its crowded streets, towering skyscrapers, churches nestled among modern buildings, and constant urban bustle now read as a snapshot of the city at the very close of the 20th century, a glimpse of New York during a period of relative confidence and prosperity, before the events that would go on to reshape both the city and the country. Religious symbolism turned out to be one of the movie's most talked about elements. End of Days was never meant as a theological treatise, but it did introduce mainstream audiences to ideas drawn from Christian tradition: Satan's temporary freedom before the final judgment, sacred relics, ancient prophecy, spiritual warfare between good and evil. Some viewers appreciated the film's willingness to fold recognizable religious themes into a blockbuster. Others felt it oversimplified or distorted biblical ideas for the sake of drama. It sparked real conversation about the relationship between faith and entertainment, with religious groups landing on both sides, some objecting to sacred imagery being used in a violent Hollywood production, others treating it as nothing more than fictional storytelling drawing on religious mythology. Those clashing reactions reflected a larger, ongoing debate about how religion should be depicted in popular culture, especially during a stretch when supernatural thrillers were borrowing heavily from biblical tradition. Building the filmmaking End of Days was almost as dramatic as the story it told on screen. Released in 1999, it was one of the most ambitious supernatural action productions of its era, combining large-scale practical effects, elaborate visual effects, extensive stunt work, and religious symbolism with a character-driven story. Pulling all of that together took years of planning and the collaboration of hundreds of artists, technicians, stunt performers, designers, and crew members. Audiences mostly remember the explosions and the dark atmosphere, but the production behind the scenes faced plenty of challenges that shaped the finished film. The project was directed by Peter Hyams, a filmmaker already established as both a director and cinematographer, known for pairing striking visuals with tense, suspenseful storytelling. His earlier credits included Capricorn 1, Outland, 2010, The Year We Make Contact, Running Scared, Narrow Margin, Time Cop, and The Relic. One of Hyams's defining traits is that he frequently shoots his own films, giving him total control over the visual style. That dual role let him design every shot with a very specific mood in mind, making sure lighting, camera movement, and composition all served the story's emotional tone. Hyams wanted End of Days to feel grounded despite its supernatural subject matter. Rather than filtering the devil through exaggerated fantasy, he believed the horror would land harder if audiences accepted the world as real. New York City needed to look like the New York people actually recognize: the ordinary streets, apartment buildings, churches, restaurants, subway stations, all serving as the backdrop for extraordinary events. That choice helped create the unsettling sense that supernatural evil could be lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. Most of the film was shot on location in New York City, which gave the production an authentic urban texture. Instead of leaning heavily on studio backlots, the filmmakers used real neighborhoods, streets, churches, tunnels, rooftops, and industrial areas across Manhattan and the surrounding area. The city's winter weather did a lot of the work naturally, contributing to the cold, bleak look that runs through much of the film. Snow, rain, fog, and overcast skies all reinforcing its dark mood. Shooting in New York wasn't easy. Many scenes involved large explosions, police vehicles, helicopters, crowds of extras, and elaborate stunt sequences that required shutting down city streets temporarily, which meant careful coordination with city officials, law enforcement, and local businesses. Night shoots were especially grueling, with the crew often working until sunrise while sticking to strict safety protocols around pyrotechnics and heavy equipment. One of the bigger production challenges was striking the right balance between practical effects and computer-generated imagery. Digital effects were advancing quickly in the late 90s, but filmmakers still leaned heavily on physical effects wherever they could. Hyams preferred practical filmmaking because it gave actors something real to react to on set, and because it tends to read as more convincing on camera. Most of the explosions in End of Days were created with real pyrotechnics rather than digital animation. Buildings rigged with carefully controlled explosive charges, vehicles physically destroyed, debris launched using compressed air systems. Every explosion demanded extensive prep from stunt coordinators, special effects technicians, firefighters, and safety officers, and multiple cameras were positioned for each one, since many effects could only be captured once. Schwarzenegger insisted on doing as many of his own stunts as he could. By 1999 he was already famous for his commitment to physically demanding action work, and despite being past 50 during filming, he took part in numerous fights, chase sequences, falls, and weapons scenes. Stunt doubles naturally handled the most dangerous moments, but a great deal of what appears on screen is Schwarzenegger himself. The physical toll was considerable, in part because Jericho Cane is a very different character from Schwarzenegger's earlier heroes. Instead of gliding through combat looking composed, Jericho is constantly injured, exhausted, and overwhelmed. The fight choreography emphasizes struggle over effortless victory, with Schwarzenegger working closely with the stunt team to make sure every confrontation reflected the character's emotional state rather than simply showing off athleticism. One especially memorable sequence has Jericho battling demonic forces inside a church. Filming it required combining elaborate set construction with practical destruction effects. Large portions of the church interior, including walls, pews, stained glass windows, and decorative details, were built specifically for the production so they could be safely destroyed on camera. The design team carefully recreated authentic architectural details to keep things realistic while still allowing controlled destruction during the action. Byrne approached his role in a completely different way than Schwarzenegger did. Where Schwarzenegger trained physically for the demanding action work, Byrne focused almost entirely on the psychology of his character. Rather than playing Satan as constantly furious or violent, he believed true evil should come across as calm and self-assured. During rehearsals he experimented with speaking softly, smiling through disturbing conversations, and keeping his body language relaxed even while making threats. Hyams encouraged him to steer clear of theatrical villain cliché copyright essay instead of big gestures or grand speeches. This Satan would manipulate people through quiet, subtle conversation, and that understated choice became one of the film's defining creative decisions. Byrne later said he wanted audiences to understand exactly why someone might trust the devil before realizing his true intentions. The story End of Days blends supernatural horror, action, detective mystery, and psychological drama into a single narrative. For all its spectacle and large-scale effects, the story is surprisingly personal at heart. A man who's lost everything has to rediscover faith, hope, and purpose while confronting the literal embodiment of evil. The screenplay gradually widens from a grounded crime investigation into a fight for the fate of humanity, raising the stakes carefully as it goes. The film opens with a prologue set in Italy in 1979. Inside the Vatican, a secretive ceremony marks the birth of a girl named Christine York, and ancient prophecy foretells that she'll one day be central to Satan's plan to trigger the apocalypse. That sequence immediately lays out the film's religious mythology and creates a sense that everything to come is inevitable. Unlike most action movies, which tend to open with explosions or violence, End of Days begins with prophecy and secrecy, the sense that events have been quietly unfolding long before the audience arrives. From there, the story jumps forward to New York City on December 28, 1999, just days before the new millennium. That time jump immediately sets up a ticking clock scenario. The audience knows there's a deadline approaching, and every scene pushes the story closer to midnight on New Year's Eve. That countdown structure keeps the tension constant, since every passing hour raises the stakes further. We're then introduced to Jericho Cane, a former police detective now working private security. Unlike the heroic introductions typical of Schwarzenegger's earlier films, Jericho first appears as a man who's fallen apart. His apartment is a mess. He drinks heavily, he sleeps with a handgun beside the bed, and his conversations reveal deep emotional exhaustion. The murder of his wife and daughter has wrecked his belief in justice, religion, and even his own future. That opening matters because it establishes Jericho's central conflict before the supernatural one even enters the picture. His real battle isn't with the devil, but with himself. He's already lost the will to live long before Satan shows up in his life, and by starting the story this way, the screenplay makes sure every supernatural event doubles as part of Jericho's path toward redemption. The plot kicks into motion when Jericho and his partner Bobby Chicago are assigned to protect an investment banker. During what looks like a routine security job, a sniper assassinates the banker, and the investigation that follows sets the mystery in motion. Strange symbols, mysterious priests, secret organizations, and unexplained deaths gradually convince Jericho that something well beyond ordinary crime is happening. This investigative stretch lets the audience uncover the supernatural world right alongside him, rather than dumping the devil's whole plan on viewers at once. The screenplay reveals clues gradually as Jericho interviews witnesses, examines crime scenes, questions religious figures, and runs into increasingly impossible events. That slow reveal keeps things suspenseful while keeping the audience engaged. The pacing in the first act alternates between action and investigation, with high-energy sequences giving way to quieter scenes where characters talk about prophecy, faith, and tradition. That rhythm keeps the action from becoming repetitive while letting important information emerge naturally through dialogue instead of long stretches of exposition. As Jericho learns more about Christine York, the film's central goal comes into focus. Satan has entered the human world by possessing a wealthy banker and intends to father a child with Christine before midnight on New Year's Eve. According to the prophecy, that child would become the Antichrist, opening the door for evil to dominate humanity. Suddenly, protecting Christine isn't just about saving one person, it's about preventing global catastrophe. Christine herself starts out as a fairly ordinary young woman blindsided by circumstances she barely understands, and her confusion mirrors the audience's own. She's spent her whole life unknowingly preparing for a destiny she never chose. And as the story unfolds, she gradually comes to accept both the reality of the threat and the weight of the responsibility now on her shoulders. That transformation gives the film real emotional depth, because Christine isn't just someone who needs rescuing, she becomes an active participant in resisting evil. The film's middle stretch ramps up the tension through a series of escalating confrontations. Jericho runs into assassins, corrupt religious figures, possessed victims, and supernatural attacks that challenge everything he thought he knew about reality, with each encounter revealing more while making it increasingly clear that ordinary methods won't be enough to stop what's coming. What the film is really about on the surface, End of Days looks like a supernatural action movie about an ex-cop trying to stop Satan from bringing on the apocalypse. But underneath the explosions and religious imagery, it's built around some genuinely weighty themes: faith, redemption, temptation, grief, sacrifice, destiny, free will, and the ongoing tug-of-war between hope and despair. Those ideas run through the film's recurring visual symbols, its characters' choices, and its overall atmosphere, making it a much richer piece of work than a standard action thriller. Redemption is arguably the film's central theme. Jericho Cane starts the story as a man who's completely lost his sense of purpose. Once a respected New York police officer, he's been emotionally hollowed out by the murder of his wife and daughter, a tragedy that destroyed not just his family, but his belief in justice, religion, and humanity itself. He drinks heavily, cuts himself off from other people, and moves through each day without any real hope for the future. In a sense, his emotional state represents a kind of spiritual death that predates the supernatural conflict entirely. He's alive, but he no longer believes life means anything. His arc throughout the film is really about rediscovering his own humanity as much as it is about saving the world, with every challenge he faces forcing him to confront the grief that's consumed him. By the end, his willingness to sacrifice himself shows that he's found redemption through selflessness rather than revenge. His personal salvation becomes tangled up with humanity's survival. Closely tied to that is the theme of faith. Interestingly, the film doesn't present faith as blind belief, but as the ability to keep believing in goodness despite overwhelming suffering. At the start, Jericho openly rejects religion, blaming God for letting innocent people die and seeing no reason to trust in divine justice. He doubts plenty of people carry after personal tragedy. As the story goes on, he witnesses things that logic alone can't explain, but even after accepting that supernatural forces are real, he still struggles to believe. The film suggests faith isn't automatically created just by witnessing miracles. A real faith is a personal choice. Jericho ultimately believes not because he's seen something extraordinary, but because he chooses help over despair. Father Kovac offers a different angle on faith. He's dedicated his life to spiritual service and his unwavering confidence in the existence of both good and evil, yet even he admits faith alone isn't enough. Courage, compassion, and sacrifice all have to go with it. Between these two characters, the film explores different expressions of spirituality without settling on easy answers. Temptation is another central thread. Satan rarely tries to defeat people through outright violence. Instead, he studies their weaknesses and offers them exactly what they want most. A concept plenty of devil stories have leaned on before. Byrne's Satan is especially effective here because he understands that corruption usually starts with an attractive promise rather than an obvious threat. Jericho's greatest temptation is the chance to see his murdered family again, and Satan keeps exploiting that wound, dangling the possibility of erasing years of suffering. That temptation carries far more weight than an offer of wealth or power, because it targets real love and real grief. The audience understands exactly why Jericho hesitates. The film frames temptation as something that can challenge anyone, not just people of weak character. Christine experiences it differently. Rather than being haunted by personal tragedy, she's driven by fear and uncertainty, facing constant pressure to give in to forces she barely understands. Her struggle represents the difficulty of holding on to innocence in a world full of manipulation and violence, and her repeated choice to resist rather than surrender reinforces the film's belief in individual moral responsibility. The tension between free will and destiny also runs through the narrative. Ancient prophecy declares that Christine was chosen at birth to play a role in the apocalypse, which at first glance suggests fate controls every part of her life. But the story keeps showing that prophecy creates opportunity rather than certainty. Both Christine and Jericho make choices that shape how things turn out, and Satan himself is constantly trying to persuade people rather than simply command them. If destiny alone decided everything, persuasion wouldn't be necessary. The film ultimately argues that people retain the freedom to choose even within larger spiritual or historical forces, which gives the story real emotional stakes. Victory depends on decisions, not predetermined outcomes. Good versus evil is obviously one of the film's most visible themes, but End of Days handles it with more nuance than most action movies. Evil here isn't just destruction or violence. It shows up as manipulation, selfishness, despair, corruption, and emotional weakness. Satan doesn't win by overpowering people physically, he wins by convincing them to give up hope. Goodness, in turn, is framed as compassion, sacrifice, loyalty, and perseverance rather than moral perfection. Jericho is deeply flawed. He drinks too much, questions God, struggles with anger, and often acts recklessly, yet he's still capable of extraordinary courage. The film suggests that goodness isn't measured by the absence of flaws, but by the willingness to push past them. Grief shapes nearly every decision Jericho makes throughout the story. Unlike a lot of action heroes who bounce back quickly from personal loss, Jericho remains psychologically trapped years after his family's death, and his anger and numbness color everything he does until he finally begins to heal. Visual style. One of End of Days' defining strengths is its visual presentation. While it's often remembered for its supernatural story and big action sequences, a lot of its lasting appeal comes from the atmosphere created through cinematography, lighting, production design, and camera movement. Peter Hyams, serving as his own cinematographer, crafted a visual style that constantly reinforces the film's themes of darkness, spiritual conflict, despair, and redemption. Every frame designed to make the world feel like it's slowly sliding into chaos as the millennium approaches. Hyams had built a reputation throughout his career for shooting many of the films he directed himself, an unusual combination that gave him complete creative control over how each scene looked. Instead of relying on a separate cinematographer to interpret his vision, he could directly shape how lighting, camera placement, actor movement, and production design worked together, and that consistency shows throughout End of Days, where nearly every visual choice supports the story's emotional tone. From the opening scenes, the film immerses the audience in darkness. Unlike a lot of late 90s action movies that lean on bright, saturated color, End of Days embraces a muted, almost monochromatic look. Blacks, dark blues, cold grays, deep browns, and washed-out greens dominate the palette, creating unease well before the supernatural elements kick in. That reduced color scheme mirrors Jericho's own emotional state. His world has gone emotionally flat since his family's murder, and the visual style reflects that. Even ordinary places, apartments, streets, restaurants, offices, look drained of warmth, reinforcing the sense that hope is getting harder and harder to find. Lighting does much of the heavy lifting in establishing the film's mood. Hyams frequently uses low-key lighting, which emphasizes deep shadow while limiting bright illumination. Faces often emerge only partially from the dark, while backgrounds disappear almost entirely into blackness. That visual uncertainty keeps tension high, since viewers never feel fully sure what's hiding just outside the frame. Many scenes rely on practical light sources rather than traditional studio lighting. Streetlights, candles, lamps, church chandeliers, headlights, emergency vehicle lights, and fire provide much of the visible illumination, giving the environments an authentic feel and producing dramatic contrast between light and shadow. The audience essentially experiences the city the way the characters do, navigating spaces where darkness could be hiding physical or supernatural threats alike. New York City itself becomes almost a character in its own right. Rather than glamorous or energetic, the film paints it as cold, overcrowded, and emotionally isolating. Towering skyscrapers dwarf individual characters, while narrow streets, abandoned alleys, industrial districts, underground tunnels, and aging churches all suggest an ancient evil has found a home within modern civilization. Hyams often frames Jericho as a small figure against enormous architecture, using wide shots to emphasize his isolation and hint at the scale of what he's up against. Even in a crowd, Jericho often feels emotionally alone, a visual choice that reflects both his psychological state and the overwhelming scope of the fight ahead of him. Camera movement stays purposeful and restrained during the investigative scenes. Slow tracking shots and controlled movement invite viewers to study the environment along with Jericho, letting suspense build gradually rather than relying on quick cuts. During the action sequences, though, the camera turns far more energetic, with handheld photography, faster tracking shots, and dynamic crane work pulling the audience straight into the chaos. Importantly, the action never becomes visually confusing. Hyams keeps a clear sense of spatial geography throughout, so viewers always know where everyone stands during a fight, an explosion, or a chase. Sound and score. End of Days is often remembered for its explosive action, supernatural imagery, and emotional performances, but its sound design and score are among its most underrated achievements. Audio plays a huge role in shaping the film's atmosphere, heightening tension, and making both the loud sequences and the quiet dramatic beats feel immersive. Composer John Debney built a score that blends orchestral music with choral arrangements, religious influences, and modern thriller elements, while the sound team crafted a detailed sonic landscape that keeps reminding the audience something supernatural is lurking beneath the ordinary world. Unlike many late 90s action films that lean on loud, energetic music through nearly every big sequence, End of Days often chooses restraint. Silence is used just as deliberately as music. Hyams understood that constant orchestral intensity would blunt the impact of the film's biggest moments, so plenty of scenes let natural sound and ambient noise carry the scene before the score gradually enters. That balance makes the moments when the music finally swells feel that much more powerful. Debney had already proven himself a versatile composer across family films, dramas, comedies, adventure movies, and large-scale action, and End of Days pushed him to write music that could support several very different storytelling modes at once. The film mixes detective mystery, psychological drama, supernatural horror, religious mythology, and blockbuster action, which meant the score had to shift naturally between emotional intimacy and full-blown spectacle. Debney built it around dark orchestral textures rather than one big memorable theme. Instead of writing a hummable, heroic melody, he focused on mood and atmosphere, layering deep strings, low brass, choir voices, percussion, and subtle electronic touches into a score that rarely lets the audience feel fully comfortable, even during calmer scenes. One of the score's most distinctive features is its use of choral music. Human voices carry long-standing associations with religious ceremony and spiritual mystery, which makes them a natural fit for a story centered on biblical prophecy and the fight between good and evil. Rather than bright, uplifting choir arrangements, Debney often uses low, haunting vocals that sound ancient and mysterious, seeming to echo through churches and empty buildings and giving the impression that unseen spiritual forces are always close by. The choir also carries symbolic weight. The film's conflict is spiritual as much as physical, and by weaving voices into the orchestration, Debney keeps reminding the audience that invisible forces are shaping events even when characters appear to be alone. The orchestration leans heavily on lower registers. Cellos, basses, trombones, French horns, and deep percussion dominate most of the cues, giving the score a sense of weight that matches the film's apocalyptic subject matter. Brighter, higher melodies show up only occasionally, usually during moments of hope or sacrifice, and that contrast makes those brief warmer passages land with real impact. Jericho's emotional journey is reflected in the music too. Early scenes involving him often feature sparse, restrained orchestration, with plenty of space between notes mirroring his emotional emptiness. As his character slowly rediscovers purpose, the orchestration fills out, letting the audience feel his transformation without needing dialogue to spell it out. Byrne's Satan gets some of the score's most unsettling musical ideas. Interestingly, the devil rarely gets a dramatic villain theme. Instead, Debney introduces subtle harmonic dissonance, low sustained notes, and barely the choral textures whenever Satan appears, a musical restraint that mirrors Byrne's calm performance. Rather than announcing evil with a loud orchestral blast, the score quietly signals that something unnatural has entered the scene, which proves effective precisely because it matches the character. Satan doesn't need to intimidate through force. His confidence comes from absolute certainty, and the music reflects that quiet power. Audiences often feel unease without immediately knowing why, which says a lot about how carefully the score is manipulating emotional response. The action sequences naturally call for a different musical approach. During explosions, gunfights, and big confrontations, Debney ramps up both tempo and orchestral intensity, with driving percussion and dramatic brass. But even in the louder passages, the music never fully sheds the darker tone established earlier, and heroic fanfares stay relatively limited, since the story keeps emphasizing survival over triumph. One of the soundtrack's more effective touches is how it lets the action scenes breathe rather than overwhelming the audience with non-stop music and sound effects. End of Days often alternates between loud and quiet within the same sequence, letting gunfire suddenly stop so only footsteps or breathing remain before the orchestra swells back in. Those dynamic shifts keep the suspense alive and prevent sensory fatigue. The sound design elsewhere is just as considered, with every environment in the film carrying its own distinct sonic identity. Reception. Then and Now. When End of Days came out in November 1999, expectations were sky high. Schwarzenegger was still one of the biggest action stars in the world, and the marketing leaned hard into the film's unusual mix of supernatural horror, religious mythology, and large-scale action. The approaching millennium made the subject matter feel especially timely, and audiences were eager for a blockbuster that dug into fears about the turn of the century. The film did respectable business, but critics were far more divided. Though public opinion has shifted a good deal since then, and many viewers now consider it an underrated entry in Schwarzenegger's filmography. Anticipation had been building for a while before release. Schwarzenegger had spent the previous 2 decades dominating the action genre through films like The Terminator, Predator, Total Recall, True Lies, and Eraser, so fans expected another powerhouse performance. But this time, the unusual premise added extra intrigue. Instead of fighting terrorists, aliens, or criminals, Schwarzenegger would be facing Satan himself, a combination of biblical prophecy and action spectacle that was fairly rare for a mainstream Hollywood blockbuster at the time. The film also benefited from perfect timing. As 2000 approached, public fascination with apocalyptic predictions, religious prophecy, and the Y2K problem reached a fever pitch, with news programs, documentaries, magazines, and talk shows constantly discussing possible technological failures or biblical end times scenarios. End of Days captured that cultural moment well, giving it a relevance a similar film released at another time might not have had. Critical reactions were mixed from the start. Some reviewers praised the ambitious concept, the dark visual style, and Schwarzenegger's willingness to play a more emotionally damaged character. Others argued the script tried to juggle too many genres at once, with reviews often describing it as a mashup of action movie, horror film, detective thriller, religious drama, and supernatural fantasy. Some critics admired that ambition, others felt the shifting tone kept the film from fully succeeding in any single genre. Schwarzenegger's performance was one of the most consistently praised elements. Critics who typically pigeonholed him as a physical performer rather than a dramatic one acknowledged that Jericho Cane was one of his most emotionally exposed roles, a deeply broken man wrestling with grief, alcoholism, guilt, and lost faith. rather than another invincible hero. Several reviewers noted that this more vulnerable approach gave the character unexpected depth, with Jericho spending much of the film questioning whether life still has meaning after losing his family, and his pain reading as genuine rather than just a setup for action beats. Even critics who didn't love other parts of the film often admitted Schwarzenegger showed more dramatic range than expected. Byrne's Satan drew similarly widespread praise. Rather than a loud, theatrical villain, he delivered a calm, intelligent, charismatic performance, and critics repeatedly pointed to how unsettling that restraint made the character a devil who smiles, jokes, and speaks politely while calmly discussing humanity's destruction. That contrast between pleasant demeanor and absolute evil became one of the film's most memorable elements. Many reviewers noted that Byrne avoided the exaggerated theatrics common to supernatural villains, leaning instead on confidence, charm, and psychological manipulation, and his scenes with Schwarzenegger became some of the film's strongest, since they play out as much through moral conflict as physical confrontation. Today, Byrne's performance is often ranked among the better cinematic portrayals of the devil in modern Hollywood film. Hyams's direction and cinematography got a similarly mixed response. Many critics praised the dark atmosphere, the realistic New York locations, and the tightly controlled visual style. The muted palette, heavy shadow work, and authentic urban settings gave the film a distinctive look that set it apart from brighter action movies of the period. But some reviewers felt the visual darkness went too far, criticizing certain nighttime scenes for being genuinely hard to see. While many audiences embraced the oppressive mood, others felt the cinematography sacrificed clarity for atmosphere, though that particular criticism has faded somewhat over the years, as audiences grew more accustomed to darker visual styles. The screenplay proved to be the film's most contentious element. Supporters liked its willingness to blend biblical mythology with modern action storytelling and appreciated the detective-style investigation that gradually revealed the supernatural conspiracy while exploring faith, temptation, and redemption. Critics argued the script sometimes struggled to balance philosophical ideas with explosive action, with some feeling the film introduced fascinating religious concepts without exploring them deeply enough, and others feeling the action interrupted emotional beats before they could fully land. That tension overtone remains one of the most frequently debated aspects of the film. Audience reactions have generally skewed more positive than the critical consensus. Plenty of moviegoers simply embraced the film as entertaining supernatural action rather than judging it as religious drama, appreciating the large-scale sequences, the practical explosions, the intense confrontations, and the chemistry between Schwarzenegger and Byrne. For viewers looking for exciting holiday season entertainment in 1999, the film largely delivered. End of Days arrived during a crowded year for cinema. 1999 also gave us The Matrix, The Sixth Sense, Fight Club, The Green Mile, and The Mummy, all of which left their own marks on popular culture. With that kind of competition, End of Days initially struggled to stand out as one of the year's defining films. Over time, though, it built a loyal following, and its reputation shifted from just another Schwarzenegger action movie to one of the more distinctive supernatural thrillers of the late 90s. Legacy. One of the film's biggest legacies is how successfully it blends multiple genres. Rather than sticking to straight action or horror, End of Days wove together supernatural fantasy, detective mystery, psychological drama, religious mythology, and blockbuster spectacle into one narrative, a genre blending that's become far more common in Hollywood today, but was still fairly unusual for a major studio release in 1999. The film proved audiences were willing to accept stories that mix intense action with spiritual and philosophical themes, and its influence shows up in later supernatural thrillers that tried to balance religious mythology with contemporary action. End of Days certainly didn't invent that formula, but it helped prove there was a commercial audience for stories where ancient prophecy and modern urban settings could coexist within the same world, and later films about demons, angels, exorcisms, and apocalyptic conflict often adopted a similar visual language, realistic environments paired with supernatural threats, rather than full fantasy worlds. Schwarzenegger's performance left a lasting mark on his career as well. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, audiences had grown used to seeing him play nearly unstoppable heroes who solved problems through physical strength and sheer will. Jericho Cane was one of the first times he fully committed to playing a deeply vulnerable protagonist whose emotional struggles mattered just as much as his physical battles. Even though the film got mixed reviews at release, many fans and critics now look back on Jericho Cane as one of Schwarzenegger's most emotionally complex characters, a proof that he could portray grief, doubt, guilt, and spiritual conflict without losing the commanding screen presence that made him a global star. A willingness to dig into more dramatic material that shaped how audiences viewed the later chapters of his acting career. Byrne's portrayal of Satan may be the film's most enduring artistic achievement. Cinema has given us countless versions of the devil, from terrifying monsters to sophisticated gentlemen, and Byrne's take stands out for its restraint. Instead of shouting, threatening, or constantly flexing supernatural power, his devil manipulates through intelligence, charm, humor, and psychological insight. Plenty of later films and TV shows with supernatural antagonists adopted a similarly understated approach, increasingly portraying evil as ordinary, charismatic, and persuasive rather than obviously monstrous. Byrne's performance helped reinforce the idea that the scariest versions of evil are often the ones that look completely human. The film also holds an interesting place in the history of millennium-era cinema. During the late 90s, plenty of movies tapped into society's fascination with the approaching year 2000. Some focused on technology, others on disaster scenarios, others on religious prophecy and apocalyptic fear. End of Days became one of the most recognizable examples of that specific cultural moment, and today it works almost like a time capsule of the anxieties surrounding the end of the 20th century. Younger audiences who never lived through the Y2K era often watch the film as a window into what people feared on the eve of a new millennium, with that atmosphere of uncertainty around computers, religion, and the future preserved right there in the narrative, making it historically interesting well beyond its entertainment value. Hyams's visual approach has also aged remarkably well, because the production relied so heavily on practical effects, real locations, physical stunts, and genuine explosions. A lot of the film still feels convincing decades later. Some of the CGI naturally shows its age, but the extensive practical craftsmanship has helped the movie hold on to much of its visual impact, something modern audiences, used to digital effects-heavy blockbusters, often comment on and appreciate. End of Days is a reminder of an era when filmmakers still leaned heavily on physical sets, real pyrotechnics, elaborate stunt coordination, and on-location shooting. And that tangible quality is a big part of why it's held up. Home media and streaming have helped the film considerably, too. During its theatrical run, audiences experienced it under the massive weight of expectations surrounding both Schwarzenegger and the coming millennium. Years later, viewers discovering it through TV broadcasts, DVD, Blu-ray, and streaming came to it without those same expectations, and many ended up appreciating qualities that got overlooked the first time around. Online film communities played a real role in that. Reassessment forums, review sites, podcasts, and video essays started digging into End of Days in more depth, and instead of focusing purely on its original critical reception, fans highlighted Schwarzenegger's dramatic performance, Byrne's memorable villain, Hyams's cinematography, Debney's atmospheric score, and the film's exploration of redemption and faith. How audiences read the film differently over time. One of the more interesting things about End of Days is how differently audiences have interpreted it over the years. When it first came out in 1999, Most viewers approached it as a supernatural action movie starring Schwarzenegger, expecting explosive gunfights, big visual effects, and a fairly traditional battle between good and evil. The film certainly delivered plenty of large-scale action, but a lot of viewers were surprised to find it also grappling with grief, faith, temptation, redemption, and sacrifice. Over time, audiences started looking past the action and appreciating the deeper emotional story at its center. Timing played a huge role in shaping how the film was received. Few movies have ever benefited from such a specific historical moment. Released just weeks before the arrival of 2000, End of Days tapped into fears a lot of people genuinely felt the approaching millennium had the world on edge. The Y2K problem had some people convinced technology could fail catastrophically, and others were focused on religious prophecies about the end of the world. Television networks aired documentaries on biblical predictions, and newspapers ran countless articles speculating about possible global disruption. Because of all that, audiences at the time experienced the film differently than viewers would today. Even knowing it was fiction, its themes felt oddly connected to conversations actually happening in homes, churches, schools, and workplaces. Watching a story about Satan trying to trigger the apocalypse during the final days of the 20th century carried an added sense of urgency, with the fictional countdown to midnight on New Year's Eve echoing the very real one playing out across the world. For a lot of Schwarzenegger fans, the film offered something unexpected. Over the previous 2 decades, he'd become famous for playing nearly unstoppable heroes who overcame impossible odds through strength and confidence. Characters like the Terminator, Dutch from Predator, John Matrix from Commando, and Harry Tasker from True Lies rarely showed sustained emotional weakness. Jericho Cane upended that completely. Audiences met him as a man already broken before the story even begins, wrestling with depression, alcoholism, guilt, and hopelessness instead of tossing off confident one-liners. Some viewers initially found that jarring given Schwarzenegger's established image, but plenty came around to appreciating the change. And over the years fans have often called Jericho Cane one of his most human characters, his vulnerability making him more relatable than a lot of the larger-than-life heroes he'd played earlier in his career. Rather than admiring him purely for physical strength, audiences connected with his emotional pain and his determination to keep fighting despite feeling like life had already beaten him. Byrne's Satan generated equally strong reactions. Many viewers expected a terrifying monster or an over-the-top supernatural villain, and instead encountered someone calm, intelligent, funny, and remarkably polite. That interpretation stuck with people because it suggested evil rarely announces itself. His devil doesn't rely on constant violence or grand speeches, but manipulates by understanding people's weaknesses and offering them exactly what they want. That resonated because it reflects real human experience. Temptation is often subtle, not overwhelming. Byrne's Satan represents corruption through persuasion rather than force, and his conversations with Jericho remain some of the film's most memorable scenes precisely because they play out as emotional conflict rather than physical confrontation. Grief is a theme audiences consistently bring up. Almost everyone experiences personal loss at some point, which makes Jericho's emotional journey feel universal. A few people face supernatural battles, but plenty understand what it means to feel abandoned, hopeless, or stuck in tragedy. That's part of why the film's exploration of grief lands on such a personal level. Viewers often read Jericho's struggle as representing anyone who's questioned their faith or purpose after real suffering, and his anger at God reflects emotions plenty of people have privately wrestled with during hard times. Rather than offering easy answers, the film lets audiences watch a slow, hard-won process of healing through courage and self-sacrifice. Characters worth a closer look. Part of why End of Days keeps resonating is that its characters run deeper than they first appear. The film delivers plenty of explosive action and supernatural spectacle, but its emotional foundation rests on the personal journeys of its main players. Every major character goes through some kind of transformation, a growth, temptation, sacrifice, or a revelation of their true nature. At the center is Jericho Cane, a man who starts the film emotionally defeated and eventually rediscovers what matters. The supporting characters each embody different facets of faith, hope, evil, loyalty, and human choice, making character development just as important to the film as the fight against the devil. Jericho is unquestionably the emotional heart of the story. When we first meet him, he's already broken, a once respected nip detective destroyed by the murder of his wife and young daughter, a loss that shattered his faith, his sense of justice, and his belief in his own future. Rather than trying to rebuild, he's let grief take over completely. The film shows that collapse through his daily routine: heavy drinking, a loaded handgun by the bed, minimal self-care, and a total lack of enthusiasm for each new day. He does his job as a private security officer competently, but there's no passion left in it. His life has become mechanical, driven by habit rather than purpose. Unlike a typical action hero, Jericho doesn't start out eager to save the world. If anything, he questions whether the world's worth saving at all, a cynicism rooted in years of unresolved trauma. He openly rejects religion, resents God, and doesn't believe life is fair or meaningful, which makes him one of Schwarzenegger's most psychologically complex characters. As the supernatural events start unfolding, Jericho initially reacts the way he would to any police case, looking for logical explanations, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, relying on his experience as a detective. But the deeper he gets pulled into the mystery around Christine York, the clearer it becomes that ordinary methods can't explain what he's seeing. That shift is essential to his arc. Jericho doesn't suddenly become a believer after witnessing one miracle. His transformation happens gradually, through repeated confrontations with events that challenge everything he thought he knew about reality. Each one forces him to reconsider not just whether supernatural forces exist, but his own understanding of hope, purpose, and forgiveness. One of his defining traits is that he keeps protecting innocent people even while believing his own life has little value. He risks himself for Christine well before he regains any real sense of hope, which shows that beneath the grief, his moral compass is still intact. The tragedy damaged his spirit, but it didn't erase his basic decency. His relationship with Christine becomes one of the driving forces behind his recovery. At first he sees her simply as someone who needs protecting. Gradually, she comes to remind him of the innocence and goodness he'd believed had vanished from the world, and protecting her starts to feel like protecting hope itself. Jericho's biggest internal conflict comes not from physical attacks, but from Satan's attempts to manipulate him, repeatedly offering him the impossible dream of seeing his murdered family again. Those scenes reveal that what Jericho really wants isn't revenge, but reunion, and his vulnerability makes the temptation completely believable. By the end, Jericho finally moves past the grief that's imprisoned him for years. Importantly, he doesn't erase the pain or forget his family, but comes to accept that real love sometimes requires sacrifice rather than possession. That final decision completes his arc. The man who started the film with nothing left to live for ultimately finds something worth dying for, and his journey from despair to redemption forms the emotional backbone of the entire film. Christine York goes through a quieter but equally meaningful transformation. At the start, she's an ordinary young woman with no idea about the ancient prophecy tied to her birth or the supernatural forces trying to control her future, and her confusion lets the audience experience the mystery unfolding alongside her. She initially reacts to the strange murders, mysterious priests, supernatural attacks, and impossible revelations with understandable fear rather than instant courage, struggling to process events that contradict everything she thought she knew about reality. As the story progresses, though, she develops real emotional strength, making active choices instead of just reacting to what's happening around her. Even once she understands the full weight of her role, she refuses to give in to despair or manipulation, and her resolve matters all the more because Satan's plan depends not just on prophecy, but on breaking her resistance. In the end, Christine comes to symbolize hope and free will. Ancient prophecy may define her importance, but the film keeps insisting her choices still matter, reinforcing its larger theme that individuals retain moral responsibility no matter what forces surround them. Byrne's Satan offers one of the film's more fascinating character studies. Unlike Jericho, the devil doesn't really change over the course of the story. He already has complete confidence in himself. Instead of growth, what we get is different facets of his personality revealed as the plot unfolds. Costumes and production design. One of the most overlooked strengths of End of Days is its costume and production design. Audiences tend to remember the action, the supernatural elements, and Schwarzenegger's performance, but the visual world built by the costume designers, production designers, set decorators, makeup artists, and art department does a lot of the work making the story believable. Every location, costume, and small detail contributes to the sense of a world standing on the edge of the apocalypse. Rather than going for an exaggerated fantasy look, the filmmakers chose realism, letting the supernatural events unfold within environments that feel authentic and familiar. That production design starts with New York City itself. Instead of the glamorous, energetic city seen in a lot of action films, End of Days portrays New York as cold, gritty, and emotionally exhausting. Wet streets, weathered buildings, dark alleys, and public spaces that feel crowded yet oddly isolating, all mirroring Jericho's emotional condition. Rather than building elaborate fictional sets, Hyams chose to shoot extensively on real New York locations. Office buildings, churches, apartments, restaurants, tunnels, subway entrances, rooftops, industrial warehouses, city streets, giving the film a grounded setting that contrasts sharply with the increasingly supernatural events happening within it. Because those locations feel genuine, audiences find it easier to accept the extraordinary things happening in them. The urban environment constantly reinforces the film's themes. Massive skyscrapers tower over individual characters, making them look small and vulnerable. Narrow streets create a sense of confinement. Abandoned industrial areas suggest decay and neglect. Even the busy public spaces rarely feel warm or welcoming, a visual approach that keeps emphasizing that the battle between good and evil is playing out in the ordinary modern world, not some distant fantasy realm. Jericho's apartment is one of the most telling sets in the film, communicating his psychological state without needing much dialogue at all. Cluttered, dimly lit, sparsely decorated, and clearly neglected, with empty bottles, unwashed dishes, and scattered belongings revealing a man who stopped caring about his surroundings. Unlike the stylish apartments common in Hollywood action films, Jericho's home feels genuinely lived in and painfully real, with few decorative touches because his emotional life essentially ended after his family was murdered. The apartment functions almost like an extension of his mind. Its disorder mirrors his grief. Its lack of warmth mirrors his inability to move past tragedy. And as the story keeps returning to it, it becomes an important emotional anchor, a constant reminder of the life he's lost and the emptiness he carries throughout the film. Churches are some of the most visually striking sets in End of Days, standing as centuries of religious tradition against the modern city around them. High ceilings, stained glass windows, stone columns, candlelit interiors, wooden pews, ancient statues, and detailed religious artwork creating spaces steeped in history and symbolism. The production team focused on authenticity rather than exaggerated fantasy. Churches, recreating spaces that feel like genuine places of worship, which strengthens the supernatural elements by making audiences believe these locations have existed for generations before the story even begins. The contrast between sacred architecture and modern New York is especially effective. Outside, traffic, skyscrapers, and urban life dominate inside. Silence, candlelight, and centuries-old religious imagery remind viewers that spiritual tradition continues to exist just beneath the surface of contemporary society. One of the more striking aspects of the church sets is how they transform over the course of the film, starting as places of safety and reflection before becoming battlegrounds where the supernatural conflict turns physical, a destruction that carries real emotional weight because audiences understand exactly what these spaces represent. Costume design is just as important in establishing character. Jericho's wardrobe reflects his personality perfectly. Dark leather jackets, heavy boots, worn shirts, plain trousers, all practical clothing for someone who values function over appearance. His leather jacket in particular has become one of the film's most recognizable costume pieces. Unlike the polished suits worn by a lot of action heroes, his clothes look aged and weathered, suggesting years of wear and reinforcing the sense that he's stopped caring about how he looks. His wardrobe communicates exhaustion and emotional distance before he even speaks. The dark tones running through his clothing also tie him visually to the film's overall palette. Black, charcoal gray, dark brown, and faded earth tones blend naturally into the shadow-heavy environments Hyams created, with Jericho almost disappearing into the darkness around him, reinforcing his emotional isolation. Christine's costumes, by contrast, evolve alongside her character. Early on she wears fairly simple, contemporary clothing appropriate for an ordinary young New Yorker. Soft colors and lighter, casual fabrics that emphasize her innocence and normalcy before she learns about the prophecy tied to her life. As events grow more dangerous, her wardrobe becomes more practical and subdued, and while the changes are subtle, they reflect her growing awareness of just how extraordinary her circumstances have become. The screenplay plays a much bigger role in the film's success than it often gets credit for. Audiences naturally remember Schwarzenegger battling supernatural forces, but the action alone would have meant very little without a script that dug into grief, temptation, faith, redemption, and sacrifice. The writers faced a genuinely difficult challenge, blending several very different genres into one coherent story. The film needed to work as an action blockbuster, a supernatural thriller, a detective mystery, a psychological drama, and a religious fantasy, all while keeping the characters believable and the emotional momentum going. Critics were split when the film first came out, but plenty of viewers have since come to appreciate the screenplay's ambition and its willingness to explore ideas rarely found in traditional action movies. One of its biggest strengths is a character-first approach. Rather than opening with the devil or the coming apocalypse, the story introduces us to Jericho Cane, a man whose personal world has already ended before anything supernatural happens. We understand exactly how broken he is following his family's murder. That choice gives the story emotional weight right out of the gate. The writers wisely avoid making Jericho a stereotypical action hero. He's not confident, optimistic, or eager for another dangerous mission. He's bitter, exhausted, deeply cynical, and convinced life has nothing left to offer him. And because the screenplay establishes those wounds so early, audiences become invested in his personal recovery long before the larger conflict even kicks in. Dialogue plays a big part in revealing Jericho's psychological state. Much of what he says during the opening act comes from frustration rather than heroism. His conversations are often sarcastic, emotionally distant, or openly hostile toward religion and authority, rather than built around memorable one-liners meant purely for entertainment. He talks like someone who's lost faith in almost everything around him, which marks a real departure from a lot of Schwarzenegger's earlier work. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, He'd become known for catchphrases and wisecracking action dialogue. End of Days deliberately dials that back in favor of more serious, emotional exchanges. The result is one of his most dramatic performances, because the script lets him express vulnerability instead of constant confidence. Byrne's dialogue as Satan is another highlight. Unlike a lot of cinematic villains who rely on loud speeches and obvious threats, his devil speaks calmly, intelligently, and often with surprising humor. His conversations rarely involve shouting or overt intimidation. Instead, he quietly picks apart human weakness while dangling tempting alternatives to suffering. Part of why these scenes stick with viewers is that Satan almost never lies outright. He tells carefully chosen truths and lets characters talk themselves into destructive decisions. His dialogue reveals a deep understanding of psychology. Rather than forcing people into evil, he invites them to justify their own choices, which makes him a far more compelling antagonist than a villain who relies purely on violence. The verbal exchanges between Jericho and Satan sit at the emotional center of the film, and they're really about competing worldviews more than physical conflict. Satan argues that humanity is naturally selfish and corrupt, and Jericho, even while initially agreeing with a lot of that pessimism, gradually finds reasons to believe otherwise. Those conversations turn what could have been ordinary action beats into genuine philosophical debate about hope, suffering, and the value of human life. The screenplay handles exposition with surprising restraint, too. Stories built around ancient prophecy, biblical mythology, and supernatural rules can easily bury audiences in explanation, but End of Days reveals information gradually through conversations with Father Kovac, police investigations, newspaper articles, historical references, and events as they unfold. Rather than one long info dump about the prophecy, the script lets Jericho piece the mystery together bit by bit, which keeps the audience actively engaged. Since they're learning right alongside the protagonist, every answer raises a new question, keeping suspense alive through much of the film. Father Kovac's dialogue does important narrative work of its own. As the character with the most knowledge of the supernatural conflict, he easily could have become a pure exposition device, but the screenplay gives him warmth, humility, and real concern for Jericho's emotional state. His conversations rarely feel like lectures, they play more like two men approaching the same mystery from different angles. Christine's dialogue reflects her gradual growth as well. Early on, her conversations are full of confusion, fear, and disbelief, since she has no reason to accept the impossible things happening around her as real. As the story progresses, her dialogue grows more confident. She asks fewer questions and makes more decisions, which tracks with her growing inner strength. Pacing is another notable strength. Dialogue-heavy scenes are carefully balanced against action, with the film frequently slowing down after a big explosion, shootout, or supernatural encounter to let characters process what just happened. Those quieter beats keep the story from becoming emotionally exhausting while giving the audience time to sit with the personal fallout of each event. The screenplay also knows how to use silence, as some of the film's strongest moments contain almost no dialogue at all, like Jericho sitting alone in his apartment quietly looking through photos of his family, a scene that communicates enormous emotional depth without a single speech. Selling the apocalypse. The marketing campaign for End of Days was one of the most ambitious promotional pushes for a supernatural action film in the late 90s. Released in November 1999, just weeks before the new millennium, the film benefited from a real-world situation no marketing department could have manufactured on its own. People everywhere were already talking about the year 2000, Y2K, biblical prophecy, and predictions about the end of civilization, and the studio built its entire campaign around the idea that the biggest battle in history would unfold during the final days of the 20th century. The title itself was one of the first things that grabbed attention. Short, dramatic, and instantly evocative of apocalyptic stakes, End of Days didn't need extensive explanation to get its basic premise across. Paired with Schwarzenegger's image on posters and trailers, it promised both large-scale action and supernatural suspense, and it stood out among the rest of that year's releases precisely because it tapped into conversations already happening in everyday life. The teaser campaign leaned heavily on mystery rather than spelling everything out. Early promotional material showed dark city skylines, burning crosses, religious symbols, clocks counting down toward midnight, and glimpses of Schwarzenegger's troubled character, without immediately revealing Satan or explaining the prophecy. The ads encouraged audiences to ask their own questions. What was ending? Why did the millennium matter so much? Who was Schwarzenegger fighting? That approach worked because curiosity about the year 2000 was already baked in, and the marketing didn't need to invent urgency, since the calendar itself was doing that work, with every ad reminding audiences that the fictional countdown in the film closely tracked the real one happening around the world. The theatrical trailer became one of the campaign's most important tools, balancing action, horror, mystery, and emotion without giving too much away. It opened with mysterious religious imagery before introducing Jericho Cane as a man haunted by personal tragedy, then gradually built intensity through explosions, supernatural events, violent confrontations, and glimpses of Byrne's calm but unnerving devil. Crucially, the trailer signaled that this wouldn't be a typical Schwarzenegger action movie. Alongside the gunfights and explosions, it showed emotional scenes highlighting Jericho's grief and inner struggle, suggesting something different from his previous blockbusters and appealing to both action fans and audiences drawn to supernatural thrillers. Music played a major role in the trailers, too, with dramatic orchestral arrangements, powerful percussion, and choir voices building an epic atmosphere that reinforced the religious themes, while the rising tempo echoed the countdown to the new millennium and gave every trailer a sense of urgency. The official movie poster became one of the campaign's most recognizable pieces of artwork, Schwarzenegger standing against a dark background, often surrounded by flames, smoke, religious imagery, or an ominous cityscape. His expression conveying determination alongside real emotional exhaustion, a look that reflected Jericho Cane rather than Schwarzenegger's usual invincible heroes. Dark colors dominated the design, with black, deep red, orange fire, and gray smoke reinforcing the apocalyptic mood, while religious symbols appeared subtly rather than overwhelming the composition, a balance that hinted at supernatural themes without pushing the film squarely into horror territory. Several international markets got alternate poster designs, but nearly all shared the same core visual elements: fire, darkness, urban landscapes, crosses, and Schwarzenegger front and center, with Byrne's devil usually shown only partially or through symbolic imagery to preserve the mystery around his character. Television advertising made up another major piece of the campaign, with short commercials running during prime time, sports broadcasts, and entertainment programming. Different ads emphasized different aspects of the film depending on the target audience. Action-focused spots highlighted Schwarzenegger's fights, explosions, car chases, and gunfights. Horror-leaning ads featured darker imagery, supernatural events, mysterious chanting, and religious symbolism. Some commercials focused on the relationship between Jericho and Christine, while others zeroed in almost entirely on the coming apocalypse. That variety let the studio reach multiple audience segments without diluting the film's core identity. The approaching millennium turned out to be one of the campaign's biggest natural advantages. A few films have ever benefited from such an organically occurring promotional moment. News coverage of Y2K, religious documentaries about biblical prophecy, and widespread public curiosity about the year 2000 all unintentionally reinforced the film's themes. The marketing team cleverly avoided making unrealistic claims while still letting audiences connect real-world anxiety with the fictional story, suggesting that, while the world braced for possible technological failure, the biggest threat might actually be something far more ancient. Schwarzenegger himself played a major role in promoting the film. By 1999 he was one of the most recognizable movie stars on the planet, and his involvement alone guaranteed extensive media coverage. In interviews, he frequently talked about how different Jericho Cane was compared to the heroes he'd played before. Where it fits in the genre, End of Days occupies a distinctive spot in late 90s cinema precisely because it borrows from so many genres while refusing to fully commit to any single one. Simultaneously an action film, a supernatural thriller, a horror movie, a detective mystery, and a religious drama. Plenty of films throughout history have explored biblical prophecy, demonic possession, or the fight between good and evil, but few have tried to merge those ideas with the kind of explosive action style Schwarzenegger built his career on. Setting End of Days alongside similar films, earlier supernatural stories, and other work by its director and star helps explain why it still stands apart more than 25 years after release. The most obvious point of comparison is The Omen. Both films revolve around biblical prophecy and the possibility of the apocalypse. The Omen focuses on the birth and rise of the Antichrist through a slow-burning horror narrative, one that relies on psychological tension, mystery, and mounting dread, with violence that's sudden and shocking rather than constant. End of Days approaches similar material from a very different angle. Instead of building suspense through quiet horror alone, it fuses supernatural mythology with large-scale action. Its devil isn't an unseen force lurking in the shadows, but an active participant walking openly through modern-day New York. And Schwarzenegger's Jericho confronts evil directly through physical combat, while also grappling with emotional and spiritual crisis. As a result, End of Days feels much closer to an action epic than to traditional horror, even though both films explore related religious ideas. Another interesting comparison is The Exorcist, widely regarded as one of the greatest horror films ever made. It focuses almost entirely on faith, possession, and spiritual warfare, keeping the conflict intimate. Centered on one family and two priests confronting demonic evil and emphasizing fear, psychological realism, and religious ritual over spectacle. End of Days blows that same conflict up to a much larger scale. Instead of protecting one child from possession, its characters are trying to stop the complete domination of humanity. The themes of faith, temptation, and sacrifice carry over, but the storytelling leans far more heavily into action. Where The Exorcist asks whether faith can overcome evil, End of Days asks whether one broken man can rediscover faith in time to save the world. The Prophecy series offers another useful comparison point. Those films explore conflict between angels, humanity, and heaven itself, often presenting supernatural beings as morally complicated rather than simply good or evil, and like End of Days, they use religious mythology as a foundation for modern storytelling. But End of Days differs in its focus on redemption over theological conflict. Its supernatural mythology exists primarily to support Jericho Cane's emotional journey. Biblical prophecy drives the plot, sure, but at its core, the film remains the story of one grieving man rediscovering hope, and that emotional emphasis gives End of Days a more personal quality. Despite its apocalyptic scale, released just months earlier in 1999, Stigmata shares several thematic threads with End of Days: a religious mystery, ancient prophecy, supernatural forces, and questions about faith in the modern world all show up in both films.